I'm Anthony Jewett from St. Mary's in Park City, and this is Rejoice in Hope, an audio series on discovering Jesus Christ. In 1973, just outside the city of Akita in Japan, a Japanese nun named Sister Agnes Sasagawa reported that she had received apparitions from a carved wooden statue of Mary in her convent. Sister Agnes claimed that she had heard messages from the statue and had seen the statue become animated. And on top of that, Sister Agnes received the stigmata on her hands, and it was reported by the nuns at the convent that the statue had the stigmata as well. Something notable here is that Sister Agnes was completely deaf before entering the convent. As the nuns in the convent began focusing on the statue after these reported apparitions from Sister Agnes, they realized that the statue was weeping. And it wept on 101 separate occasions. And the news of this apparent miracle quickly spread throughout the world. We hear about so many miracles and reported apparitions throughout the history of the church, but very few people seem to take them seriously. The rationale is that so many of these events occurred at a time before modern science could be used to investigate the claims. Something that might be able to be explained through natural means was otherwise labeled as a supernatural phenomenon. But the apparition of Our Lady of Akita is a bit different. This didn't take place hundreds of years ago. It was 1973, when we had plenty of scientific capabilities at our disposal. We also had new methods of recording these events through pictures and video. So when we look at the individual claims of this apparition, there's something to back up each one of them. First, Sister Agnes reported hearing the voice of Mary through the statue, but she was deaf. And we have medical documents to prove that she was completely deaf before joining the convent. But her hearing was completely restored after the apparition. Second, Agnes received the stigmata, but so did the statue. It was described by the nuns as small and very precise cuts in the shape of a cross that formed on the hands of the statue and produced blood. The blood was taken to a lab, it was tested, and it was revealed to be type B human blood. The statue also no longer has those incisions on the hands. And finally, the statue is best known for its occasional weeping. The tears came from the eyes of the statue and fell down the body. They were collected, sent to a lab, and came back as type AB human tears. No one can explain how the statue wept, but we do know that it did in fact weep. In 1973, we had the benefit of using TV cameras to capture one of these moments. There are so many elements to this event that make it impossible for us to ignore. The evidence for something supernatural happening continuously built up until the local bishop got involved and approved the veneration of Our Lady of Akita. By 1988, Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, who later became Pope Benedict XVI, gave his verbal approval to the veneration as the head of the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith. The Catholic Church has looked at the evidence of this event and has rightly been open to its possible divine origins. But we live in a world where miracles don't exist in the general public. If something appears supernatural, there must be a scientific explanation for it. And if there are multiple unexplained phenomena attributed to one event, like Our Lady of Akita, people are still going to refuse to believe that there is any possibility of divine intervention. Eventually, reason is just thrown out the window and all evidence is completely rejected, so that anything outside of our understanding through the natural world doesn't inconvenience us. In the case of Our Lady of Akita, we have mounting evidence of something miraculous happening based on scientific studies. In the exact same way, we have plenty of evidence for the historicity of the resurrection of Jesus Christ based on historical science. So let's give a quick recap of little details that we know about the resurrection. First, Jesus' execution by means of crucifixion was a scandal to his followers. You could also describe it as a failure of his movement. Second, soon after his death, but not immediately, his followers came out of hiding and enthusiastically spoke of his resurrection from the dead. They didn't just carry on his teachings or his cause or his religion, which would have been understandable. They claimed that he lived. Third, they based this not on belief, but by personal eyewitness testimony, from people like Peter to even Paul, who was an enemy of the church and who claimed to see Jesus alive after the crucifixion. Fourth, his burial tomb was empty. The witnesses to the empty tomb were women, and women's public testimony was not accepted at this time in history. So if the Christians stole his body and wanted to make it more acceptable to the public, they would have had a man testify to the empty tomb rather than women. Also, the claim of the resurrection began in Jerusalem, where Christ died and was buried. So if anybody wanted to disprove the Christians, they could have gone to the tomb immediately upon hearing of the resurrection and indicated that the body was still there. Fifth, the followers of Christ are completely changed from who they were even while he still preached in his ministry. Something internal happened to them because of something they experienced externally. Sixth, and one of the best testaments to conviction, a significant number of these followers, especially the leaders, chose to die rather than to deny that this happened. And seventh, millions of people converted to Christianity despite the prevailing aversion in Greek culture to the idea or the concept of bodily resurrection. Within 400 years, this belief in the resurrection led to the most powerful religion in the known world. We need to reiterate that these details don't prove the resurrection, but they do serve as evidence of something historical happening rather than something that was completely made up. And for the sake of honesty and transparency, we should also look at why historians might reject the resurrection. The oldest and most plausible explanation for the details we just went over is that this was all a fraud, invented to give credence to the Christian movement. They stole the body from the tomb and they preached the resurrection to deceive people. Another possibility is that the belief in the resurrection was a myth that evolved from some sort of historical details. What Christians believe today might not be what Christians believed in the days after Christ's death. Maybe they even stole from other pagan myths to try to ease their own problem with death. And finally, the claims of the resurrection and Jesus' subsequent appearances are supernatural, which, as we know, that's just simply unacceptable to the modern critic. Jesus' followers must have willfully induced these visions of Jesus after his death, similar to people's claims of near-death experiences or claims to have seen loved ones after their own traumatic deaths. So let's address the first objection. If the Christians made up the story of the resurrection, what was their motive? The only logical conclusions for doing this was persecution, jail, or death. They gained nothing out of it except for, persecution, jail, and death. So who would actively accept these things, especially death, for what amounts to be a hoax? Regarding the second objection that this belief and claim evolved from previous pagan myths, Christianity is in fact quite different from these stories. Jesus was a human being who lived during the lifetime of those who claimed the resurrection. He wasn't a Greek demigod who existed hundreds or thousands of years before the myth began. Our modern claims to the resurrection of Christ are also identical to the claims that were made 20 years after the resurrection at the latest. And finally, could the disciples have just been seeing some trauma-induced visions of Christ after his catastrophic death? Well, this would at least explain their change in behavior and their willingness to go to their death to defend this idea. But the issue that this theory does not address is how were they able to convince millions of people who did not experience those appearances of Christ? Also, how did someone who hated and actively persecuted Christianity like Paul experience this same type of appearance of the resurrected Christ? He obviously was not going to be affected by the trauma of Christ's death like the Christians were. This theory also refuses to address the empty tomb. You see, all of these theories require ignoring at least some of the evidence we have for the resurrection. And if we were to simply take the leap of faith that the resurrection might be true, that at least takes into account every single piece of evidence we have. We'll continue with trying to approach the resurrection logically and historically in our next episode, but I want to make it clear why we are doing this. Trying to prove the resurrection is pointless if we do not understand why we are trying to prove it. According to the visions of Sister Agnes Sasagawa, Mary did not just weep from a statue for the spectacle of it. Attached to this event were important messages that Mary shared to Sister Agnes that were meant to be shared to the world. In that same way, Jesus didn't resurrect from the dead as merely his final epic miracle. All of Christianity and all of the church's beliefs and claims unravel without the resurrection. Once we establish that the resurrection is worthy of belief, everything else easily builds upon this single most important event in human history.